Do shared ancient repetitive elements support common ancestry? Okay, what is an ancient repetitive element? Well, we're going to get to that. But this is an interesting question. Michael Shermer, who is the head of the Skeptic Society, president of that, and publisher of Skeptic Magazine, actually came to the Creation Museum a few months ago, back in March, and he interviewed me. And if you want to watch the interaction there, you can Google it on, or you can look at it on YouTube, and you'll find it there. It was an interesting exchange, but this was one of the questions that he asked me, and so I decided, wow, that's definitely going to be one of the ones that I put in my presentation, so I thank him for that. The facts are, we do have repetitive elements. There's no doubt about that. And what are these repetitive elements? They compose 50% of our DNA is repetitive. Okay? It's the same kind of thing over and over again. 45% of those, or 45% of that's considered transposons, or what we call jumping genes. 3% are repeats of less than 100 base pairs, so they're not very big, but certain segments that are repeated. And 5% are duplications of large segments of DNA. Again, this is what we see, okay? This is a fact, okay? This is what we can actually observe in the human genome. But the real question is, though, how did it get there, okay? How did we get all of these repetitive elements? And that's where the word ancient comes in here, okay? Ancient repetitive elements and evolution. They're considered ancient because they find them in lower organisms. So you might see the same thing in a mouse, or you might see the same thing in a dog, or a bacteria, or whatever, and the same thing in us. So they say, well, because you see them in lower organisms, they're ancient. That's their philosophy on that. The other thing is, and this is really problematic, they say they're not functional. They are merely evolutionary leftovers from our ancient past, as we've evolved from one organism to another, and that organisms that have a recent common ancestor, like humans and chimps, or even mice and humans, should have very similar ancient repetitive elements. Again, that whole idea of if they're similar, we must have a common ancestor. And so there's two issues we need to deal with here. First of all, are they or are they not functional? Because that's an important thing to talk about. And secondly, if they are similar, does that imply common ancestry? So that's what we're going to look at. But first, the issue of functionality. And I'm going to share with you some quotes. And we're going to talk a lot about some quotes from The Language of God, which was written by Dr. Francis Collins, who is a theistic evolutionist. And we get a lot of questions about him recently, and so I wanted to share some information from his book so that we can better understand this. He's just recently been appointed to head up the National Institutes of Health, and he played a major role in the Human Genome Project. So he's a very well-respected and well-known scientist, so a lot of people pay attention to what he says. Well, he said this in his book: mammalian genomes are littered with such AREs, with roughly 45% of the human genomes made up of such genetic flotsam and jetsam. When I first read that, I thought, what is flotsam and jetsam? I'm not familiar with that. It has to do with kinds of debris in the ocean, is what that is. So it's trash, basically. Notice he says they're littered. Okay, so he's implying that they really don't have a function. But there's a problem with that, because repetitive elements are actually functional. They do have a function, and there is a lot of evidence to support that, even evidence that was out at the time that he wrote this particular book. So I'm going to share with you a quote concerning that functionality of sequences in the human genome. It says, while less than 1.5% of the mammalian genome encodes proteins, or genes, it is now evident that the vast majority is transcribed, mainly into non-protein coding RNA. So it's made from DNA into RNA, not into proteins. It just stays as RNA, doing something as RNA. This raises the question of what fraction of the genome is functional. Many of the observed non-coding transcripts, or RNAs, are differentially expressed. I mean, they're expressed differently in the brain than the liver. And while most have not yet been studied, increasing numbers are shown to be functional. Thus, it is likely that much more than 5% of the genome encodes functional information, and although the upper bound is unknown, it may be considerably higher than currently thought. And so it's not an evolutionary leftover, but rather it's very, very important. It's a functional part of our genome. And next I want to share with you some research that was done by Dr. Richard Sternberg. Now, that name might sound familiar to you. If you've seen the movie Expelled, he was one of the first scientists that was interviewed in that particular movie, and he's associated with the intelligent design movement because he ran into some problems when he actually published one of their papers in a journal that he looked at. And so what he decided to do was kind of have a compilation of all these repetitive elements and see, are they functional, are they doing something, drawing from the literature that's out there. And you know what? Now, I know you can't read this, and I don't expect you to, but he came up with repetitive element after repetitive element after repetitive element that has a known function. Table after table after table, okay? So a lot of these elements do have a particular function, and he went on to say this: our expectation is that one day we will think of what used to be called junk DNA, or these repetitive elements, as a critical component of truly expert cellular control regimes. I like that word, expert, okay? Intelligently designed by the Creator God to do something in our genome. So even though Collins does not admit the functionality of AREs, he does think they're important. They're especially important when it comes to the issue of common ancestry. And he says this: when one aligns sections of the human and mouse genome anchored by the appearance of gene counterparts that occur in the same order, one can usually also identify AREs in approximately the same location in these two genomes. So he said, if you have gene A and gene B, and you match them up, in between there's this ARE. Okay, this repetitive element. And you can see that over and over and over again. So he goes on to say, okay, he thinks this is really important. Of course, some might argue that these are actually functional elements placed there by the Creator for a good reason. And our discounting of them as junk DNA just betrays our current level of ignorance. And indeed, some small fraction of them may play important regulatory roles. But certain examples severely strain the credulity of that explanation. Okay, so what he's saying is that, he goes on to then say basically that a lot of these repetitive elements are damaged, defunct, and decapitated. Okay, those are the three words that he likes to use. But does he really know that? Absolutely not. It is completely based on what we call a prejudicial conjecture, that most of what is called junk DNA really is junk. Why does he think that? Because of his evolutionary starting point. This is what you would expect to see. There should be junk. There should be remnants of the past, and indeed that's what you see. And because it's a remnant of the past and we no longer need it, it's become damaged, defunct, and decapitated. Now, again, he doesn't actually know that. Okay? He's just conjecturing that. And again, even though we've only studied a minority of these elements, those tables showed you that they do have a function, and our knowledge is continuing to increase in there. They are indeed functional. Now, he goes on to say, after quite a little bit about talking about these damaged, things in our genome, he goes on to say, unless one is willing to take the position that God has placed these decapitated AREs in these precise positions to confuse and mislead us, the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. This kind of recent genome data thus presents an overwhelming challenge to those who hold to the idea that all species were created ex nihilo. Wow, okay, that's a power-packed paragraph, and we're going to take it apart piece by piece here. So the first part, he's basically saying common ancestry or evolution is true simply because God wouldn't have done it that way, okay? He wouldn't have had these AREs in the same place, in the same genomes, in different organisms. He just wouldn't have done it that way. Okay, now, again, he says, especially if they're damaged, there's no way. Now, how does he know what God would do? Now, I agree he wouldn't put damaged, information in there in the same place, in the same organisms. He didn't do that. That's a result of the fall. If they are no longer functional, that's something that's happened as a result of the passage of time. But he's being completely arbitrary. How does he know? He doesn't. Obviously, it would never be to mislead or confuse us because God does not lie. He doesn't do that to us. But can't the divine creator God use similar parts in similar organisms? I mean, animals and man, especially mice and humans, we are both mammals. Can he do that? Absolutely he can do that. He is a logical, orderly God, and that's what we would expect from him, and that's exactly what we see. So, going on now, he says, the conclusion of a common ancestor for humans and mice is virtually inescapable. See that term again, kind of like Ken Miller used. There's no doubt about it. But once again, our friend, the logical fallacy. Okay? He's affirming the consequent. He's saying, if humans and mice share a common ancestor, then we should observe these shared AREs. Well, shared AREs are observed between humans and mice. Therefore, humans and mice share a common ancestor. Again, just because the grass is wet doesn't mean it rained. And just because we share similar AREs doesn't mean we have a common ancestor. We have a common designer God who probably put them there for a very good reason. And we need to figure that out. We need to do that. And as creationists, you know what? We have a reason to do that because we believe that God designed it that way. But the evolutionists, they don't really have a reason to do it because after all, it's just an evolutionary leftover, right? Why bother? That's prohibiting science. Whereas we as creationists are progressing science because we see that as the result of God and we want to study it and we want to figure out what it's doing. Now, the very last argument he says here, he says this is an overwhelming challenge to those who hold to the idea that all species were created ex nihilo. I don't know of any creationist that believes that all species were created ex nihilo. Okay? This is very commonly heard. This is called a straw man argument. Okay? So he's going to basically set up an argument that we don't even use and then destroy it. But we don't even use that argument. So that's the problem with it. And this scientist here says, hi, I'm a creationist. He's, for the little puppet here, hi, I'm a creationist. I don't believe in science. Everybody knows science is real. What else don't you believe in? Well, creationists don't believe that animals change. But science shows us that animals do change. Absolutely, I totally agree that animals do change. I never said God created all species ex nihilo, because his word doesn't say that. It says he created kinds ex nihilo. He created the different kinds, which we believe is about the family level of classification, not genus, not species, but family, okay? So again, that's the problem with that type of argument. He's setting up a straw man. So what can we say? Well, we can say that junk DNA is not junk, and we really need to rename that. We've got to figure out a better term to use for that because it's just very problematic. Shared AREs are not evidence for common ancestry. That is a logical fallacy, and those that argue who God wouldn't have done it that way are being completely arbitrary. And a common designer equals common designs. That's exactly what you would expect to see, and that's exactly what you do see.